This is House Planning Help episode 166. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, 7 self-builders answer the question, what I wish I'd known before starting my projects. And I'll explain how this one came about, because it's actually been on our development list for some time, and I perhaps wanted to do it in a slightly different way. Maybe as I went around interviewing, just grabbing a piece of audio, what's the thought that comes to your mind on this particular question? And it's one that takes a little bit of work to put together, and it's been a back burner idea. And then this week came along where I'd had a couple of interviews that potentially were going to go ahead, and both of them ended up being cancelled. So instead of thinking, well, let's just skip a week, I always enjoy putting together a podcast. So I thought, right, how can I do this? What is left? What value can I offer? And that's when I decided, well, let's just try and pitch this question to a few self-builders that I know, hopefully people that are okay with the fact that this will be a rush turnaround. And so I fired it out, and within, I suppose, more or less a 12-hour period, I've had a number of responses, which are your 7 self-builders. The number at the beginning of today's episode was flexible. It would have gone up and down depending on how many people responded. But I think we've got enough good material here that you're going to enjoy this episode. So that's it. Yeah, life gets in the way sometimes. And when you're trying to not only run a business, but you've got the family responsibilities and building a house. Of course, we need to mention that. So a big thank you to everyone that I mentioned in today's episode. And we start here with Mark Tiramani. Now, all of these people that I mentioned, we'll put the links into the show notes back to episodes if they've recorded podcasts before. And Mark says, I don't generally wish for stuff in the past. It's a waste of the present and the future. But having said that, we didn't understand Passive House enough to realise how simple the basic principles are. With a clearer introduction, there would have been much less confusion. With less confusion, we could have had more fun. But most of all, we had no real understanding of our hillside site. With very little level ground, 3 acres of 35 to 45 degree slopes and 500 metres of track, the amount of energy required just to keep things ticking along was greatly underestimated. So if I had one wish, it would be that we had had enough money left over after the build to buy a decent second-hand 1-ton mini excavator. Seriously, he says. What I'm going to do is, we made a video with Mark, actually, sometime after he'd moved into the house. Just what's it like to live in a passive house? That just ended up being a video that I made with him. And so I got to go there, and it is a stunning location, moving from very urban area to rural Wales. And I remember at the time, this was a place, because I was arriving at night, that I could have got seriously lost, and just by luck, I decided to ask someone. That was the most sensible thing to do, and I was roughly in the right place, so I was sent up this track. And I think he's right, that sometimes you maybe just look at all that beauty and forget about some of the practical side of things. So yeah, good one. Looking at not only, I guess, the practicality of building it, but then living there too afterwards. Moving on to Angie Dallas, who lives in Golcar Passive House. I think it's fair to say that were we to do another build, I would make a more informed choice of architect. Not something we had pre-considered due to our naivety. We chose on personality. And as it happens, we have a beautiful house which suits us well, despite the input of 3 architects, one of which professed to be an architect, but didn't in fact have that qualification. How green were we, she says. We had a magnificent building team, carefully chosen, and have not had any dispute throughout the whole process. The electrician and joiner had worked for us previously, so we had no surprises there either. I was lucky to have a conversation early on with an interior designer who advised us to consider the soft finishes at the beginning of the build. Had we not done that, we could not have had the blinds and curtains in the bedrooms. They also rehashed several internal details to improve the layout and reduce the number of bathrooms and make the views from the bedrooms better. Just while we're on this point, actually, it's something that I want to do, interview an interior designer in the near future for the podcast, because We hear this time and again, don't we, how people say what you need to do is make sure that you inform this person at the beginning of the project. And sometimes that is quite difficult because you're thinking about 101 other things. I'll continue. I've visited umpteen house building shows, assembled a wish list, and carefully researched new products and build options. It's been interesting looking back at what was on the list and what we actually have, and thankfully, what we didn't finish up with. Lesson there, I guess, too. I wouldn't doubt the merits of building a passive house and hope I never have to live in anything other than one. Thank you, Angie. Appreciate your input today as well. I'll embed the video of Bill Butcher from Green Building Store having a wander around, obviously explaining some of the design of Gold Cart Passive House. So we'll put that into the show notes. It's interesting if you haven't seen it before, also on the Green Building Store websites. Let's move on to Kingsley Barraclough, who did a SIPS build, actually, and he's a great correspondent, always so quick. I think he must have his phone in his hand all the time, or maybe not, maybe it's a laptop, I don't know, but straight back with this, and not only just one item, he's gone in for a good handful here, so off we go. We'll start with his number one, timeframes. For those unfamiliar with the planning process, I think even the most capable together adult rarely appreciates the jelly-like quality of the planning process. You see it, you think you grasp it, and then you watch it slip through your hands. What do you do, he says. His second point is identify from a very early stage experts that you can call on if something goes awry. For example, identify a planning consultancy and speak to them so you have a name in the event that you find you learn less than you thought from your informal meeting with the planners. Find a local builder who knows the patch and whose work you've seen and ask him for comments about the location and your intentions. Kingsley's third point, services. Allow for up to 90 days for services to be put in. Roadworks, even minor ones, can require publishing in the local paper and 90 days notice to local populace so they can plan accordingly. Extraordinary, but true. Fourth point, sorting your address. This is one that I haven't come across before. Ever heard of a National Land and Property Gazetteer Officer? Nope, nor had I, he says. In order to establish my house name was acceptable, I had assumed I would go through the post office, collecting a postcode en route. Not so. After days of chasing, I found the rare beast aforementioned who checks with the land registry, who then advise the post office, and assuming there is no other property similarly named and that the name chosen won't lead to public disorder, then it is granted. So what, he says? Well, it's very difficult to get suppliers, Barclaycard, whoever it might be, to amend your address once they have guessed it based on incomplete information. So this is good. This is a few things that didn't come out in our interview with Kingsley that he's obviously still remembered. His next point also links back to that. BT require your full street address to give you a line. Everyone else can cope with the plot adjacent to number 5 Acacia Avenue, etc., but not BT. So when the nice man in the call centre asks you for your full address, make sure you have one. My house is so named because in extremis, that's all I could think of. Sugar cubes. Building sites get through a lot of sugar and spill even more. Guess who is paying for it? Buy a large supply of sugar cubes and IKEA cups, a kettle and some kind of fridge. Camping, car one with mains adapter or eBay. Making available a means of tea, coffee is heartening to your team. As I live next door, I made a lot of tea, but £100 worth of kit would have been an even better idea. Photos. If you can manage it, be there to photograph things at each critical stage that you might wish to have available later on, i.e. pipe runs, cable runs, etc. See, this list is comprehensive. Well done, Kingsley. Nearly there. Get used to the fact that, on budget or not, there may well be £100,000 spent before you see much out of the ground. It's not something you have to think about when you buy a finished one out of the box. This is actually something that I've been wondering about as you go into this process. It's the risk side, isn't it? That not only am I holding onto a piece of land now that I have bought and invested a lot of money in, but there's nothing useful about it yet. And it's the same with all of these things. You're throwing money at it, hoping that you're going to be living there one day. Penultimate point, put together a really good map with directions and the preferred route for deliveries that you can email in advance to suppliers. If you live in the countryside and have windows coming from Germany, They won't know Mrs. Trellis down the road is cheesed off about having her grass verges being mashed down by lorries approaching from the wrong end. And finally, have some sort of get-together to thank your builders, designers, architect, etc. to say thank you. In the heat of everyone preparing for the next job, it often gets forgotten. Well done, Kingsley. Good compilation of useful information there. Moving on to Robert Young. Just a reminder of the question that we're answering. What's that one thing that you wish you'd known before you started your project? And this one is really about groundworks and plot. Robert says, virtually all of our problems arose prior to the build. The stressful part as a first-time self-builder was that all the preparatory tests incurred significant costs and were not guaranteed to bring about positive outcomes. We were spending a lot of money and could have been told at any stage that the project could not go ahead. So we had a preparatory fee for the architect, and then to the planners £1,000. The planners said we needed a tree survey, £800, which was positive. The planners said the land might still have been consecrated. The Church of England deconsecrated the land. This had to be advertised in the local press, £600. The Ministry of Justice gave us permission to excavate the site, which also had been advertised, £800. A contractor took away the excavated soil and subsoil, £1,100. The planners insisted on archaeologists then checking over the site, £2,500. The site had been worked, so a plate test was needed to see if the ground would support the house, £1,000. A contamination survey was required to see if lead poisoning or residual viruses were a possibility, £500. The underlying geology needed to be checked in detail owing to a glacial clay band, £750. The foundations had to be rethought with piles and a raft, greatly increasing the groundworks budget. Whew, what a list. Oh dear. He goes on to say, I'm not sure how we could have resolved these problems short of building on a different site, but that would have made the process too expensive on our limited budget. Once they were all overcome and resolved, we moved into a calm phase of building, which worked well. I think our architect produced a detailed spec with little or no wiggle room. Our builders were very keen to produce their first passive house to a really good standard. You just don't know, do you, with groundworks? You can guess, but until you've started digging, this is where they say that above ground you should be able to tie down those costs. But particularly, I've had that a couple of other times. I think Tara and Dimitri, their build as well, had a lot of money sunk into it before there was any guarantee that it was going to go ahead. And yeah, it's nerve-wracking, isn't it? Because you don't want to pour money down the drain. Robert, thank you for that. Really, really useful, particularly that little cost analysis as well. Next, we have an email from Donald O'Leary. My answer is a little different, as I did know this before we started, but it was still our biggest single issue. Delays and dependencies. Even with a contract with a single builder, the delays and dependencies were the main reason for hold-ups and variations. The other key thing to realise is that the sheer volume of decisions you have to make, often on the spot or with very little time to think, can be overwhelming. Aside from the technical things, communication is absolutely vital. Never assume anything, always call someone in as soon as possible to clarify and write it down if at all possible. Donald, thank you very much. Some really good information there. And just going back to those decisions, I know you're making decisions all the time, but I have a feeling that point is up ahead for me. And it is one that makes me nervous to think, can I cope with all of that? And what is the effects of either doing it badly, going through those key decisions and making poor choices, or just becoming completely overwhelmed by it. I don't need to know what hinges we need to use. Thank you, Donald. Much appreciated. Let's move on to someone who wants to remain anonymous here. Interesting point. I didn't imagine this would come up. Radioactive radon gas doesn't just come from the ground beneath your house. It can be emitted from many common building materials that you use inside your home. And there's no requirement in the USA for the products to either measure their radon emissions or warn you on the packaging. Radon is the largest cause of lung cancer after smoking. 4 picocuries, I think it is, per litre of radon in a room is the actionable level at which you're expected to begin mitigation efforts. I suggest that before you buy any large quantity of building materials and install them inside your house, you test those materials first. And she actually goes on to describe how that might happen. Any material mined from the earth can contain minuscule grains of uranium, which emits radon gas, including concrete components, clays and tiles made from clay, gypsum products, metals, etc. We're in a high radon level area and wanted to do the sustainable thing and obtain our materials locally. Keep in mind that radon levels in minerals from the earth do vary widely by locale, so your results may differ drastically from ours. And if you do find high levels in your building materials, there's a chance you can find lower levels in materials from other regions of your country not considered to have the same high levels of radon. I hope this helps you and many other people avoid harm from this invisible, odourless, heavier than air, toxic gas. Thank you, anonymous person. And there's definitely more research we need to do in this area, because I imagine in our homes at the moment we've invited in all sorts of things which are not too good for us. And at least in a passive house, I suppose the air is being replaced, but that's not the end of the story, as we've discovered on previous podcasts. Let's move on. We've got a couple of shorter ones just to finish up on. And this is actually, I want to do a podcast, and I think I spent most of last year getting in touch with Nicola and Dennis saying we must sort this out because it's a lovely building that they have on the south coast, which I wanted to use as a case study. We'll get there eventually. Nicola and Dennis go and say, I wish I had known I had a limited amount of time to apply for my solar thermal grant, as I missed out on it. It was, and still is, difficult to keep up with new technology. You never get like a car review where they rate, for example, 4 cars together. It would be good if this happened, for example, with ventilation systems. And as I mentioned, hopefully we'll have a podcast with them at some point. And just an extra one off Twitter from Robin Hillier, who said, it will take longer and it will cost you more than you thought. I imagine this will ring true for a lot of us, unless you're really on your game. So there we go. That was our episode. Big thanks to some quick respondees there who fired an email back and allowed me to put together this episode. And what a range of different topics we've covered today. Groundworks came up a couple of times, didn't it? Yeah, that's one to note, but all sorts of things. Radon and various tips for inside the house, interior design. Thank you. So in the show notes for this episode, we'll link you back to those that have been interviewed on the podcast, just so you can go and check out the full stories if you haven't already. Going to read a couple of iTunes reviews. Extremely good podcast on green building, says Orinoco 3. For anyone interested in passive house and green home building in general, this podcast is excellent and very well produced by Ben. The interviews are fascinating and overall it's become one of my favourite podcasts. Thank you very much, Orinoco 3. Do one more from Jay Rich. Great podcast for all aspiring self-builders. As a structural engineer and aspiring self-builder, this podcast provides a wonderful source of information and a great range of guest speakers. I'm looking forward to hearing how Ben moves through the process of developing his own self-built property. Many thanks and good luck. Slowly, I think, will be the answer. Yeah, I'll give you some more updates as you're pretty much up to speed, I think, of where I am in the project. We're dealing with materials at the moment. And actually, no, we've got some planning constraints that might be throwing a spanner in the works. But we'll get to that another time when we've resolved it and I can review that whole section of the process. So next week, an exciting week. I hope if you've been sitting on the fence thinking, Ben, I would like to join the hub. We are opening the doors for enrolment. It'll be a 10-day window. We'd love you to join the hub. There's lots to take advantage of. I'm not going to tell you again here. There's no point me telling you. You might as well get yourself on the waiting list and then you can find out. We can email you and let you know everything that we have inside the hub, give you a bit of a walk around. So houseplanninghelp.com/join if you want to get on the waiting list for the hub. We are very, very nearly there for our next enrolment. So thank you so much for listening today. Always appreciate your company. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.